In this week's episode, I'm joined by Jessica Bantom, DEIB practitioner, interior design consultant, and author of Design for Identity. This week, our conversation is about a trans model in the Starbucks India's new ad campaign, Apple's new voice feature for people with ALS, and more. Hey there, my name is Bernadette Smith. Welcome to 5 Things in 15 Minutes, my weekly show where I bring good vibes to DEI. That is good vibes to diversity, equity, and inclusion with a little dash of corporate social responsibility. What I've found is that there are lots of news stories about what's going wrong in the world and lots of negative data. But there are also a lot of things going right. That's what I like to focus on. I search for DEI stories that we can be inspired by and learn from. My hope is to inspire you to experiment with some of these inclusive actions and policies within your own organization to help you build a more inclusive world. Welcome to the show, Jessica. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I would love for folks to get to know you a little bit. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm Jessica Bantom. I am merging my backgrounds in DEIB and interior design to explore designing for identity, which, as you mentioned, is the title of my book. So my focus as a consultant, speaker, and author is really making space for a deliberate conversation about identity in the design process, both with customers and among design teams themselves.
I am absolutely fascinated by your work. And I will say, I've had a lot of different guests on the show. You're the first one I've had that's been an interior designer. And I would love to hear more about your thesis. Like, what's your perspective? How do we need to be considering diversity and equity and inclusion in the design process? What are some of the factors we should be considering?
Well, for one, we should just be talking about it. That's been a big gap, as I've seen it throughout my design education and throughout the practice of design, is that we don't acknowledge it. We talk about so many things with our customers about what's important to them about the space, what functions they'll perform there, what they want it to look like, but we don't talk about what will make it meaningful to them and what about their identities they would like to celebrate in the space. So that's just, that's one of the conversations I feel like we just need to become more comfortable having and more deliberate about having, because designing without input from the customers from a cultural standpoint is going to be performative.
And that makes sense.
Yeah. And you look at the design industry at large. I mean, it's predominantly white, and designers at the same time design for everybody. So when there's that disconnect between the composition of the practice and the composition of the people that we serve, we have to be intentional about how we're going to address that.
That makes sense. So how can you give examples of how we can be intentional? What does that actually look like for a designer who is white? Let's just say they're designing for a Black couple. So what are some of the things they should be thinking about when they're doing that, when they're working with that client? Or what are some of the prompts or conversations they should be having? What does that look like?
Sure. So in conversations with the customers themselves, it does go back to that main question, which I offer several questions in the Design for Identity Blueprint in my book, but this is the one I hope people really, resonate with and really sticks with them, is what about your identity would you like to see celebrated in this space? And then leaving it open, because you never know what people will share with you, what is really important to them. I think our minds automatically go to racial identity, ethnicity, gender, but there's so much more about what makes us us. And we'll never find out what's important to people unless we ask them that question. And then I would also say that that white designer in that moment also needs to be aware of their own identity. I mean, let's just acknowledge what's happening in the moment. And that could mean that that they tag in with other designers of other backgrounds, maybe team up with them, even if they're just talking through what the conversation with the customer might be like, or making sure that they are really incorporating factors that are going to be things that honor identity and are not appropriation, just so there's that conversation happening on both sides of the table, not just with the customer directly, but also as a designer being proactive about seeking out knowledge and just being aware that identity is going to play a part in what the final product is.
There's a lot there that I really wanted to follow up on, but it's really great. One of the things that I heard you say was to ask the couple, what about your identity do you want to see brought into this design, or something to that effect. Now, I mean, what a powerful question. I love that open-ended question, and it just gives folks the space to, really express themselves. But I can imagine a lot of white folks being intimidated to even ask that question, right? So how do they push past the discomfort besides, get over themselves and just grow up? But
Right. And I mean, I will say in that scenario, the Black couple could also be caught off guard by that question.
Sure.
So it's a matter of all of us just kind of leaning into it. And like I said, there is power in leaving it open ended, because everybody can engage to the extent that they feel comfortable, quite honestly. But it sends a signal. Asking the question sends the signal that, number one, I recognize I don't know I don't know everything. And I can't answer this question for you. And it also makes space to say, like, I really care about this. I want to know what's important to you. And I will say, I have asked this question myself, because I like to practice what I preach. And it did take my clients off guard. Mm-hmm. But that's just because it has not become a norm in our conversation. But once we got into it, it opened the doors for a conversation where we connected about things that I don't think we ever would have gotten to if that question wasn't deliberately put on the table.
Yeah, I mean, inclusion requires intention, right? And we just have to start those conversations and not be afraid of them. Well, there's so much I want to talk about. So my last question about your book, or about this concept, is about, basically design is a team sport, right? I came from the wedding industry, also a team sport. And I would imagine that having a diverse set of suppliers has got to be really important to the success of a project, and really sort of knowing who you call on. You don't always have to use the same window treatment person or business, right? I mean, like, diversifying your suppliers must be a part of this as well, right?
Right. And it's interesting because you can't talk about identity without being made more aware of it in every space around you. So while a large focus of the Design for Identity Blueprint, like I mentioned, is introducing these new questions with the customer, it is also having conversations among the design team, and really looking at, who comprises our team, what voices and perspectives do we have on our side of this interaction, and do we need to be more intentional about bringing in different voices, and how can we do that in different ways? And that will show up at different points of, as you mentioned, throughout the design process. It's, at the beginning, you're probably engaging more with the clients directly. Then you get to talk to the customers. Then once you start really getting into concepts and turning those into reality, that's when you're looking at, like, oh, who are we getting these materials from? Where can we source these things that maybe the client shared with us that we're not even familiar with?
Right.
So, in that process of exploring that and looking at different things and elements to fold into the design, you're likely to tap into more diverse networks to make those things happen as well.
That makes sense. Okay, last question for you before we get into the good vibes. This is a question I ask everyone. So in your work, Jessica, what is giving you hope?
I will say what gives me hope are the little aha moments. I know we talk a lot about measuring DEI success in numbers, just as a whole. Are we increasing diversity among our leadership team? What do our recruitment numbers look like, et cetera, et cetera? But there is a really critical component to me, which is observable behaviors. How does the conversation sound? How are people engaging? Are people being more bold and leaning into these conversations that we used to not have? And I see that happening. And I had the experience, fortunately, of seeing that as a DEI officer, and watching an organization mature over time, over the course of 2.5 years of really getting into their DEI journey. And the things that really kept me going were, we have monthly DEI learning sessions. When the team asked to make them longer,
Wow.
That to me was a win. When they were saying things like, I'm having different conversations with my children now because of what we're sharing here, that is a win to me. And those things are happening despite the headlines, despite whatever we may be hearing. To see those things happening on an individual level, to me, I'll take all of those wins.
Yeah, I hear you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's really powerful, seeing the response, seeing the I think it's kind of like contagious in a good way, right?
Right.
But what it has to click, right? And so once it clicks, and then it starts to feel less intimidating and less overwhelming, and we can all just be a little bit more quote unquote normal with each other. Not overthink things as much.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into this week's 5 things. By the way, the story that I shared at the beginning of 5 things, so before I get into the good vibes, was about how I was meeting with a potential client last week about a keynote. And they said in the keynote, don't congratulate us on what we're doing well. We don't want people to see that and get complacent. And I understand that because I don't want people to get complacent either. But I also think we have to celebrate the wins, and we need to keep celebrating and rinse and repeat and do it over and over and over again so that there's momentum. So I'm wondering what your perspective is uh, on whether we should congratulate folks on what they're doing well, or risk not do that because we don't want them to get complacent. Any thoughts on that based on your experience?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge those, whatever those wins are, because people need to understand that progress is being made. And unless we articulate what progress looks like, then they'll just think, oh, we're still doing this DEI thing. I don't know where it's going. I don't know where we're trying to get to, et cetera. I think it's important to celebrate those wins in the context of your organization's overall story and journey. So that, even to highlight things like, just like I said, like, oh, this is a win, for people to say, I want to have these, like, we want to have longer conversations about this. A year ago, people were hesitant to even say a word. And now we're at a point where you all want more. You want to have more opportunity to interact. That is a win. To me, the things like that are significant. I know that sometimes people can perceive that as like giving people a cookie, and you're just like, you realize this is just one tiny step, right? Like, we have a whole lot more to go. But if we don't acknowledge that, then people don't really know what effective DEI looks like. So I think it's really powerful in creating that narrative and painting that picture.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's sort of the premise of 5 things is, hey, let's celebrate these wins. And yes, they're imperfect, but we'll keep doing more of them. That's the premise. So you all know that I love celebrating wins. So let's get into this week's good vibes. The first story comes from Apple, which is introducing a new accessibility feature called Personal Voice that allows individuals with ALS to easily create and use a digitized version of their own voice, because ALS often weakens the muscles used for speech, making communication increasingly difficult. So this technology really streamlines an existing process, makes it a lot more simple and certainly affordable, because I think it's built into new iPhones or the new iOS. So I love this story.
Yeah, this was amazing. And it's to me another sign that there is progress. That things are happening. And one of the things I particularly liked about this story is they mentioned that they actually worked with people with that lived experience of having ALS, because that's critical. In making sure that you're not just designing for people, that you are bringing their experience into this. It's not just a product that's being created based on a perceived need. So yeah, that was just really exciting to see.
Yeah, I think it's like, what is it, for us, by us, right? We need to bring those people into the conversation. Otherwise, it's going to be an inauthentic product or service. Absolutely. Okay, and the next story comes from the software company Autodesk. And they recently renamed their diversity and inclusion team Diversity and Belonging. But what they're really doing is some great strategies that are working. They've seen increased belonging scores for women and employees of color. One of the things that I love that they're doing is they're giving out poker chips to managers to prevent dominance in discussions, so that folks have to actually use a chip in order to contribute, so they're not basically overspending and dominating the conversation. They're providing bonuses to leaders of employee resource groups, which is not something we see a lot of. They relocated an office to Atlanta to attract more Black engineers. So really, really good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting to me, though, to see that concept, the way that they led with moving from diversity and inclusion to diversity and belonging as an attempt to kind of rebrand DEI. And I take a lot, I have a lot of opinions about the use of terminology in this space overall, I will say. That idea of trying to rebrand it by changing one word, to me, I don't see where that's necessarily going to be impactful. And this obsession with naming kind of, to me, detracts from actually doing the work that we need to do. But I
Fair
do,
enough.
as somebody who uses belonging in my title, I do see that being a positive step in incorporating that into the discussion. Because to me, inclusion is about, this is how I think you would like to be included. This is an effort from the stance of the leadership, the organization, to include you. Belonging is the other side of that coin, saying, okay, is this really resonating with you? Are we doing the right things? And that prioritizing of belonging, I think, is critical, because it's like switching from the golden rule of, I do for you as I would have you do for me, as opposed to the platinum rule. I will show up in a way that resonates with you. I think that's that is a critical nuance. But like I said, I have a lot of thoughts about it.
You know what? I love your thoughts, and I absolutely welcome it. I think that's great. And what I think sticks out to me here is the substantial policy changes and what they're actually doing to hopefully make it not just be, walking the talk or talk. Did I get that right? But hopefully it's something that actually is authentic. But that's the thing with some of these stories and some of these policies. Sometimes they change later on. I talked about Bud Light in a positive way last month, and things went down the tube pretty quickly there. Anyway, next story comes from the New York City Council, which has passed a bill making it illegal to discriminate against height and weight in housing, employment, and public accommodations. So weight-based discrimination disproportionately affects women, particularly women of color, and can lead to lower wages and opportunities. And actually, data reveals that weight and disability bias are the only types of biases not decreasing over time.
Yeah, this is a big one. And it's interesting to see it tackled in this way. I think that is definitely encouraging. I do see that, as a win. And I think that is going to be one of our biggest, issues to tackle. It seems so ingrained in who we are, and it's imprinted on us, I think, from such an early age in so many different ways. But to see now that there is there's legal recourse in those instances is definitely encouraging.
At least in New York City. So maybe it will catch on. Okay, next story comes from Starbucks India, which has a new ad campaign called Start With Your Name, which features a transgender woman named Arpita reconciling with her parents. So it shows her introducing herself by her chosen name, her parents gradually accepting her identity. And what I love about this is that this campaign is being released in a country that's currently debating civil rights for LGBTQ plus folks. I mean, I think this really takes a stand.
Definitely. And I love that the discussion and that media is addressing this in different cultural contexts as well, because it does have different implications from one place to another, one group to another, one region to another. And to seeing that commercial is really, it's like, oh, okay. Then I take it as a sign of progress.
Absolutely. Especially when there are lots of other companies being under attack right now by right-wing folks who are calling them woke, and the woke will go broke kind of thing. And so I don't think that's going to happen with Starbucks, but we might see backlash. But you know what? They're going for it anyway. Okay, the last story this week comes from the government of Canada, which has announced that starting from December 15th of this year, federally regulated workplaces will be required to provide menstrual products to workers at no cost. All workers who menstruate, including cisgender women, non-binary folks, trans men, intersex individuals, etc., can have access to menstrual products, which can be very expensive. And there are folks who have to decide whether to buy period products or whether to buy a gallon of milk, right?
Right. And first of all, I'm just glad to see that periods and menopause and all of these natural elements of being in a female body are becoming more commonplace in terms of conversation. Uh, it's amazing to me that it's taken this long, and it's amazing to me. Even as I was reading that story, I was like, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about how basic of a need that is. And, in the grand scheme of other basic needs that facilities fill in general, why would that not be one? So yeah, definitely.
Exactly. All right. Well, this week's call to action is a podcast interview with Target CEO Brian Cornell. And he's a true believer in DEI and Target, and he gives a lot of credit to Target's recent success due to their DEI initiatives. And I am a super fan of Target, really love what they're doing, and especially for supplier diversity and amplifying Black-owned businesses. Would love for you to check out that podcast. We'll make sure that it gets in the comments and in the show notes. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today. How can folks contact you?
Sure. You just check out jessicabantom.com. Probably the easiest way to get to me and find out about my speaking, ordering Design for Identity. But I'm also very active on LinkedIn and Instagram, where you can just search Jessica Bantom. Fortunately, pretty uncommon name, so easy to find.
And you can see all of your beautiful interior design work.
Yes. Got a few sample projects up there to check out as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And folks, if you don't already get the 5 Things newsletter, you can subscribe at 5thingsdei.com. Thank you so much and have a great week. Thank you for listening to 5 Things in 15 Minutes. I hope you found yourself inspired by at least one of this week's stories. If you did, would you mind sharing it with a colleague and leaving us a review on your favorite podcasting platform? And if you don't already get my 5 Things newsletter, join at 5thingsdei.com. I'm Bernadette Smith, and I'll see you next week right here for 5 Things in 15 Minutes, bringing good vibes to DEI.